Picture this, a country where crime doesn't just shock you, it leaves you scratching your head, wondering how any of it could possibly be real. Welcome to America, where true crime isn't just dark, it's downright bizarre. From heists so absurd they sound like movie plots to criminals who fumbled their way into infamy, the stories we're about to uncover will blur the line between tragedy and comedy. These aren't your average crime tales, they're the ones that make you ask, how did anyone think this would work? Think about the last time you heard a true crime story that stuck with you. Chances are it wasn't just the crime itself, but the sheer audacity or stupidity behind it. That's what makes these 31 facts so unforgettable. We're diving into a world where bank robbers demanded payment in cheese, where murder plots unraveled because of a typo, and where one criminal's downfall was a Yelp review. These aren't just footnotes in history, they're reminders that reality is often stranger than anything fiction could dream up. But here's the twist, these stories aren't just about the crimes themselves. They're about the human moments behind them, the desperation, the ego, the sheer bad luck that turned these criminals into legends for all the wrong reasons. Some will make you laugh, others might make you cringe, but every single one will leave you wondering how these things actually happened, so buckle up. By the time we're done, you'll never look at true crime or America the same way again. Imagine a wave of sticky, suffocating death rushing through the streets at 35 miles per hour. That's exactly what happened in Boston on January 15, 1919, when a 15-million-gallon tank of molasses exploded without warning. This wasn't just an industrial accident, it became one of the strangest mass casualty events in American history, with 21 people drowning in a tsunami of syrup. The force was so powerful it ripped buildings off their foundations, crushed freight trains, and left survivors clinging to lampposts just to stay above the caramelized tide. But here's where it gets even stranger. The disaster wasn't just tragic, it was criminally negligent. The tank had been leaking for weeks, with locals complaining about groaning metal and dripping seams. The owners, United States Industrial Alcohol Company, ignored every warning. They even painted the tank brown to hide the leaks, putting profit over safety. When investigators later pulled apart the wreckage, they found the steel was thinner than promised, held together with brittle rivets that shattered like glass under pressure. The aftermath turned into a legal spectacle, with survivors and victims' families accusing the company of murder by negligence. For the first time in history, corporate executives were forced to testify about whether cutting corners amounted to manslaughter. The trial dragged on for years, uncovering bribes, forged inspection reports, and a shocking disregard for human life. In the end, the company was found liable and paid the equivalent of $10 million today, but not a single executive faced prison. What makes this crime so absurd isn't just the surreal image of a molasses flood. It's the fact that every death was preventable. The tank was a ticking time bomb, and the people who built it knew. Yet they gambled with lives to save a few dollars and lost. Decades later, some Bostonians swear they can still smell molasses on hot summer days, a sweet, sickening reminder of greed's deadly cost. You'd think handling a dead whale would be straightforward: cut it into pieces, bury it, let nature take its course. But in November 1970, the city of Florence, Oregon, proved that even the simplest tasks can spiral into pure chaos when bureaucracy meets bad ideas. A 45-foot sperm whale washed ashore, rotting in the sun, becoming a towering, stinking nightmare for locals. The Oregon Highway Division, tasked with disposal, decided dynamite was the answer. Yes, dynamite, because what could go wrong with blasting 8 tons of decomposing blubber into the sky? The plan was simple: use half a ton of explosives to vaporize the whale, letting seagulls clean up the scraps. But physics had other ideas. The blast sent chunks of whale meat flying farther than anyone predicted, chunks the size of boulders, raining down like a grotesque hailstorm. One piece crushed the roof of a parked car over a quarter-mile away. Spectators who'd gathered to watch the spectacle sprinted for cover as rancid debris splattered across the beach. A reporter covering the event famously gagged on air, muttering, "Oh, it's raining whale." Here's the kicker: most of the whale didn't even disintegrate. The blast just buried the bulk of it under the sand, leaving the town to deal with the smell for weeks. The engineer in charge later admitted, "Our estimate of the amount of dynamite was way off." Understatement of the century, the fiasco became a legendary lesson in how not to solve a problem, earning nicknames like the Great Whale Blast and inspiring parody songs. But beyond the absurdity, this was a crime against common sense. No one consulted biologists who would have suggested letting nature handle it. No one considered the very obvious risk of aerial whale shrapnel. It was a perfect storm of overconfidence and incompetence, turning a smelly nuisance into an international joke. To this day, the incident lives on in training videos for emergency responders, a cautionary tale of what happens when you bring a bomb to a whale fight. Most people know clowns as symbols of laughter and birthday parties, but for 33 young men in the 1970s, a clown named Pogo became the stuff of nightmares. John Wayne Gacy wasn't just a serial killer, he was a master of disguise, hiding in plain sight behind face paint and oversized shoes. By day, he was a pillar of his Chicago suburb, hosting block parties, dressing as Santa for kids, even snapping photos with the First Lady. By night, he lured victims to his home with promises of construction work or a place to stay, only to torture and murder them in a crawl space beneath his floorboards. What makes Gacy's case so chilling isn't just the brutality, it's the duality. He weaponized trust, using his clown persona to disarm suspicion. Neighbors called him friendly, charitable. Police later found victims' wallets stacked neatly in his filing cabinet, as if he'd compartmentalized his crimes like paperwork. The crawl space, dubbed the death pit, was so packed with bodies that forensic teams had to pause when the stench overpowered them. One detective described lifting a floorboard and seeing a knee and elbow just twisted together. But here's the twist that still unsettles profilers: Gacy wanted to get caught. He left trails, like handing a victim's ring to a coworker or accidentally showing a cop his handcuff collection. Some psychologists believe the clown act wasn't just camouflage, it was a taunt, a way to flaunt how easily he fooled everyone. Even after his arrest, he painted clown self-portraits in prison, smirking in one with the caption, "You can't prove it." The aftermath rewrote how America saw serial killers. Gacy proved monsters could be charming, that evil sometimes wears a rainbow wig. His house was torn down, but the lot stayed empty for years, too tainted to rebuild on. And those clown paintings auctioned off as macabre collectibles because even in infamy, Gacy's performance never really ended. The cheerful jingle of an ice cream truck usually means sticky fingers and summer afternoons, but in June 1984, that same melody became a death knell for one California family. Robert Duran, a 46-year-old ice cream vendor, parked his truck in front of his ex-wife's home and rigged the speaker to blare "Turkey in the Straw" on loop. Then, as the tune played like a twisted countdown, he stormed inside and shot his ex-wife, their 2 sons, and finally himself. Neighbors later told police the music kept playing for hours, the jaunty carnival soundtrack clashing horribly with the bloodshed inside. What makes this crime so unsettling isn't just the violence, it's the perversion of innocence. Duran weaponized nostalgia, turning a symbol of childhood joy into a harbinger of horror. Investigators found notes in his truck revealing months of planning. He'd even rehearsed the act, testing the volume of the music to ensure it would draw attention. The song choice wasn't random either. "Turkey in the Straw" was the same jingle he'd used for years to lure kids to his truck, making the betrayal even more grotesque. The aftermath left the community grappling with a chilling question. How many times had their children danced to that tune, unaware of the darkness behind the man handing out popsicles. Cops discovered Duran's truck was a rolling contradiction stocked with treats up front, but with a back compartment full of guns and hate-filled journals. He'd reportedly been spiraling for months, fixated on revenge after his divorce, yet no one suspected the ice cream man capable of such brutality. This case forced a reckoning about how easily evil can hide in plain sight. In the weeks after the murders, parents across the state flinched at the sound of approaching jingles, suddenly wary of the strangers behind the counter. And for crime psychologists, Duran became a case study in duality proof that monsters don't always lurk in shadows. Sometimes they wear a uniform, ring a bell, and smile as they hand you an ice cream cone. In the summer of 1989, a Wisconsin man named Mark Peterson stunned a courtroom with a defense strategy no one saw coming. He blamed aliens. Not figuratively, not metaphorically, but literal extraterrestrials. Peterson, accused of murdering his neighbor in cold blood, insisted gray-skinned beings from another planet had abducted him, implanted a device in his brain, and forced him to pull the trigger. The press dubbed it the Spaceman Defense, and what followed was a bizarre collision of true crime and science fiction that captivated the nation. At first glance, Peterson seemed like any other small-town mechanic, quiet, unassuming, the kind of guy you'd nod to at the gas station. But when police found his neighbor's body with 3 execution-style gunshot wounds, Peterson's story unraveled into something straight out of a tabloid. He claimed the aliens had been visiting him for years, conducting experiments, and that on the night of the murder, they'd taken control of his body like a puppet. "I could see my hand holding the gun," he told detectives, "but it wasn't me moving it. What made this case explode wasn't just the audacity of the claim, it was the eerie conviction behind it." Peterson passed multiple polygraph tests, described the alien ship in unsettling detail, and even led investigators to a remote field where he swore the abductions occurred. Psychiatrists were split. Some diagnosed him with schizophrenia, while others pointed to his ability to hold down a job and pay bills as proof he wasn't delusional. The prosecution argued he'd fabricated the whole story to dodge a life sentence, but Peterson's earnest desperation made jurors hesitate. The trial became a circus. UFO enthusiasts picketed outside the courthouse holding "Free Mark" signs. Late-night hosts cracked jokes about the intergalactic insanity plea. Even the judge admitted he'd never seen anything like it. In the end, the jury rejected the alien defense but found Peterson guilty of a lesser charge, manslaughter, citing his diminished capacity. He served 12 years, insisting until his release that the aliens were real. This case left a lasting mark on legal history, not because it proved aliens exist, but because it exposed how fragile our understanding of guilt and sanity really is. If a man truly believes he's controlled by forces beyond this world, does that make him innocent or just a killer with a really creative excuse? The question still lingers unanswered somewhere between the courtroom and the stars. In the dim gaslight shadows of 1878, Boston doctor Frank Horton seemed like any other respectable dentist. Polished tools, a crisp white coat, a waiting room filled with affluent clients. But beneath his sterile professionalism lurked a grisly secret. Horton's groundbreaking dental implants weren't the result of medical genius, they were stolen. Not the teeth, the entire corpses. When the wealthy families of Beacon Hill began noticing their late loved ones' graves freshly disturbed, no one suspected the well-mannered dentist down the street. That is, until Mrs. Elena Whitcomb sat in Horton's chair for a routine cleaning and gasped at the familiar gold filling gleaming back at her from his display case. "That's my husband's smile," she whispered, a smile she'd kissed goodbye at his funeral just weeks earlier. Horton's operation was as meticulous as it was macabre. By night, he'd bribe cemetery workers to look the other way as he exhumed bodies, using a surgeon's precision to extract only the healthiest teeth. By day, he'd implant them into living patients, charging exorbitant fees for what he called European dental innovations. The sickening brilliance of his scheme, teeth from the dead rarely triggered immune rejection, making his transplants eerily successful. But Horton's downfall came from an overlooked detail: vanity. He couldn't resist showcasing his best work in glass cabinets like trophies. When Mrs. Whitcomb spotted her husband's distinctive bridgework custom made with a rare Portuguese gold alloy, the jig was up. The trial sent shockwaves through Gilded Age society, not just for the grave-robbing, but for exposing how easily privilege could mask monstrosity. Horton's wealthy clientele recoiled at the realization that their new smiles might have come from paupers' graves or even their own neighbors. The scandal sparked America's first laws regulating cadaver use in medicine, but it also revealed something darker. Horton wasn't alone. Dozens of dentists nationwide admitted to similar practices under the table, calling it the trade. After all, why pay for cadavers when graveyards were free? What makes this crime so haunting isn't just the violation of the dead, it's the betrayal of trust. Horton didn't just steal teeth, he stole identities, turning tombstones into inventory. And for his patients, the horror lingered every time they looked in a mirror. Imagine the dread of brushing your teeth, wondering whose smile you'd really bought. For years after, Boston's elite would probe their gums with trembling fingers, terrified they might find someone else grinning back at them from the grave. In the quiet farmlands of eastern Ohio, where horse-drawn buggies outnumber cars and faith guides daily life, a series of violent attacks in 2011 shattered the peace of the Amish community, not with guns or knives, but with scissors. For most Americans, beards are just facial hair, but for the Amish, a man's beard is sacred, a symbol of devotion and adulthood that's only cut after marriage. So when a rebel faction led by 76-year-old Bishop Sam Mullet began forcibly shearing the beards of their religious rivals, it wasn't just assault, it was spiritual warfare. The attacks unfolded like scenes from a dark folktale. Masked men would burst into homes at night, pinning victims down as electric clippers buzzed. One 70-year-old man described waking to 6 attackers holding him down, hacking at his beard while his wife screamed. Another victim's mustache, a prideful symbol of his leadership, was ripped out by the roots. Mullet's followers later bragged about stuffing the stolen hair into Ziploc bags as trophies, leaving their targets not just humiliated but spiritually violated. In their eyes, this wasn't crime. It was divine justice against those who'd questioned Mullet's increasingly cult-like rule. But here's where the case took a historic turn. The Department of Justice prosecuted these shearing sprees as federal hate crimes, marking the first time the 2009 Matthew Shepard Act was used in a religious dispute. Prosecutors argued the attacks weren't just personal, they were attempts to destroy the victim's Amish identity. Mullet, who'd styled himself as a prophet, claimed the beard cuttings were internal church discipline, comparing them to excommunication. Yet phone records revealed chilling coordination, with texts like, "We got beard," sent after ambushes. The trial peeled back layers of control in Mullet's breakaway sect. Former followers testified he'd coerced married women into sexual counseling sessions, banned mirrors to prevent vanity, and stockpiled guns for a coming apocalypse. The beard attacks prosecutors showed were about power using shame as a weapon. 9 of Mullet's followers were convicted, with sentences up to 15 years. Mullet himself got 17, though he never wielded scissors. The judge called him the mastermind who poisoned hearts. What makes this crime uniquely unsettling isn't the violence, it's how it weaponized faith. These weren't random assaults, they were calculated strikes at the soul, and for the wider Amish community, the scars ran deeper than skin. Many victims refused to regrow their beards, fearing they'd never feel pure again. To this day, some Ohio Amish still bolt their doors at night, not from fear of thieves, but from the dread of hearing clippers in the dark. Christmas morning in 1927 should have been magical at the F. Our Tripler department store in New York City. Children lined up to whisper wish lists to Santa, parents sipped hot cocoa, and tinsel glittered under chandeliers until gunfire shattered the holiday cheer. The man in the red suit wasn't just handing out presents that day, he was handing out bullets. 60-year-old James O'Connell, a seasonal Santa with a history of bar brawls, had been hired to bring joy to shoppers. Instead, he brought a revolver to work, hidden beneath his cotton-stuffed belly. When his supervisor, Frederick Strauss, cut his hourly wage from $5 to $4 right before Christmas, O'Connell snapped. Witnesses described him storming into the employee locker room, beard still glued to his face, yelling, "You've stolen from St. Nick," before firing 3 shots. One bullet struck Strauss in the chest, sending him crumpling next to a stack of gift-wrapped teddy bears. The aftermath was pure surreal horror. Parents shielded children's eyes as cops dragged Santa away in handcuffs, his fake beard now askew, crimson stains blooming on his white fur trim. Newspapers ran headlines like "Kris Kringle Killer," while psychologists debated whether the costume itself had fueled O'Connell's rage, playing a symbol of generosity while feeling cheated. The trial revealed he'd been drunk on peppermint schnapps between shifts, a detail that only deepened the absurdity. But beyond the shock value, this crime left a cultural scar. Stores nationwide suddenly vetted Santas with background checks. The phrase, "Don't upset Santa," became a dark joke among retail workers, and for the first time, America confronted an uncomfortable truth: even symbols of purity could hide violence. O'Connell served just 3 years for manslaughter, but his legacy lingered. To this day, some department stores keep silent alarms under Santa's throne, not for child emergencies, but in case the man in red himself turns rogue. What makes this story unforgettable isn't just the irony of a murderous Santa. It's the way it peeled back the curtain on holiday illusions, proving that no amount of fake snow or jolly laughter can mask human anger. That Christmas, children didn't just learn Santa wasn't real, they learned he could kill. August 4th, 1892, started like any other sweltering summer morning in Fall River, Massachusetts, until the screams began. At the Borden household, the maid discovered 64-year-old Andrew Borden butchered on the parlor couch, his face hacked beyond recognition by an axe. Upstairs, his second wife Abby lay in a pool of blood near the guest room, her skull split open with such force that brain matter clung to the wallpaper. The only suspect with motive and opportunity, Andrew's own daughter, 32-year-old Lizzie, who'd reportedly argued with her father over money just hours before. What makes this case legendary isn't just the brutality, it's the mystery that still hangs over it like the August heat that day. No murder weapon was ever found. Lizzie's alibi kept shifting, first claiming she was in the barn, then the yard, though witnesses saw neither. Most damning, she burned a dress days later, insisting it was paint-stained, not blood-soaked. The trial became a media circus, with Victorian America torn between horror that a refined, church-going spinster could commit patricide and suspicion that only a daughter could have gotten close enough to land 19 clean axe blows without raising alarms. Here's where the story twists from crime to cultural phenomenon: Lizzie's acquittal. Despite circumstantial evidence, the all-male jury couldn't fathom a woman of her stature committing such savagery. One juror later admitted, "We figured maybe some deranged tramp did it." No tramp was ever found. Lizzie inherited a fortune, moved into a mansion she named Maplecroft, and lived out her days as Fall River's most notorious socialite, throwing parties while neighbors whispered about the axe murderess who got away. But the true absurdity lies in what happened to the house itself. After decades as a private residence, the Borden home reopened in 1996 as Lizzie Borden's Bed and Breakfast Museum. Guests today can sleep in the very rooms where the murders occurred, even posing for photos with replica axes. Paranormal investigators swear Abby's ghost still stumbles through the guest room, while others claim to hear Lizzie laughing on the stairs. The gift shop sells got an axe to grind, T-shirts and bloody soap shaped like hatchets turning tragedy into kitsch. Perhaps the darkest irony, Lizzie spent her life fleeing the accusation. Lizzie Borden took an axe, yet the house profits from that same nursery rhyme. The murders became folklore, the crime scene a carnival, and if ghosts are memories trapped in walls, then the Bordens haunt us twice, once through violence and again through our macabre fascination with it. New York City's elite circles are no strangers to fraudsters, but in 2016, a 20-something woman with a thick accent and designer wardrobe outmaneuvered them all. Anna Sorokin didn't just tell lies, she built an entire persona. Anna Delvey, a German heiress with a $67 million trust fund. With nothing more than sheer audacity and a knack for manipulation, she conned her way into private jets, five-star hotels, and the inner sanctums of Manhattan's wealthiest, all while her actual bank account hovered near zero. Her scheme was breathtaking in its simplicity. Sorokin would drop hints about her fictional fortune, mentioning a Zurich-based advisor, name-dropping European royalty, then casually forgetting her credit card at brunch. The wealthy, embarrassed to question someone who seemed like one of them, covered her bills, assuming reimbursement was coming. She convinced banks to grant her $100,000 loans by forging financial statements on her iPhone. She persuaded a private jet company to fly her to Omaha for a Warren Buffett meeting that never existed. And when pressed for payment, she'd sigh about international wire delays or scold staff for their unprofessionalism, leveraging their fear of offending a VIP. But the crown jewel of her scam was the Anna Delvey Foundation, a bogus arts club she pitched to investors. She leased a $25,000 a month office, hired architects, and even secured a $22 million loan application, all for a venue that existed only in renderings. Her downfall came when she skipped out on a $62,000 hotel bill at the Beekman, where she'd lived for months. Staff finally called police after catching her sneaking in through a service entrance. At trial, Sorokin's audacity became her spectacle. She hired a stylist for courtroom appearances, scribbled notes on yellow legal pads like she was taking the notes rather than defending herself, and even attempted to dismiss her public defender, insisting she could handle the case herself. The jury convicted her on 8 counts, but not before one member admitted, "Part of me admired her hustle." What makes this crime absurd isn't just the scale of the deception, it's who fell for it. Hedge fund managers, celebrity photogs, even a former Vanity Fair editor wired her money. Sorokin exposed how easily privilege blinds people. Her victims were so convinced of their own discernment that they never questioned hers. After serving 4 years, she sold her story to Netflix for $320,000, proving even in disgrace, the grift never really ends. Most killers try to hide their crimes, but William Corvin turned his into art. For over 2 decades, the man newspapers dubbed the Nightmare Poet stalked the American Southwest, leaving behind a trail of blood and bound leather journals filled with verses so vivid they doubled as confessions. Corvin didn't just murder, he documented each act in iambic pentameter, publishing his collections under a pen name while investigators remained oblivious that the poet and the predator were the same man. His first chapbook, Midnight Harvest, hit small press shelves in 1978, its opening poem describing the rasp of rope on wrist bone and crimson watering the cornfields. Chilling stuff, but since Corvin wrote in metaphor, critics praised his gritty realism rather than calling the cops. Over the next 12 years, he released 4 more volumes, each coinciding with unsolved murders. One stanza boasted, "I carve my name in flesh, not stone," penned weeks after a victim was found with WC etched into her thigh. Another poem, Foxfire, detailed luring a victim with promises of stargazing, a tactic used in a real Nevada disappearance. The sick genius of Corvin's scheme was its audacity. He attended his own readings, signing copies for fans who had no idea they were shaking hands with a killer. At one bookstore Q&A, when asked about his dark inspirations, he smirked and said, "Some truths are too sharp for plain prose." Detectives later realized he'd even slipped crime scene details into thank-you notes to his editor, once writing, "Hope this finds you well, unlike the blonde in cabin 12. A woman matching that description had been strangled in a motel outside Phoenix 3 days prior. The case finally unraveled in 1993 when a grad student analyzing Corvin's work noticed geographic patterns. Poem locations matched murder sites with eerie precision. Police found his manuscripts riddled with clues, dates woven into acrostics, victim descriptions disguised as character studies. At his trial, prosecutors entered his books as evidence, reading verses aloud to a stunned courtroom. Corvin, ever the performer, corrected their meter when they stumbled. What makes this story so bone-chilling isn't just the murders, it's the arrogance. Corvin didn't just want to kill, he craved an audience, twisting art into a trophy case for his crimes. Today, his out-of-print collections sell for thousands on the dark web, while forensic linguists still comb his lines for hints of undiscovered victims. His last poem, scribbled in prison before his suicide, ended with a couplet. "The ink dries black as midnight's tongue slash, but my words outlive the rope." A boast or an admission, either way he was right. The humid streets of Florida in the mid-90s hid a nightmare straight out of Gothic fiction, except this wasn't a novel. It was real. Rod Ferrell, a 15-year-old with a fixation on vampires, didn't just dabble in role-playing games. He built a cult, convinced his followers they were immortal blood drinkers, and led them on a killing spree that left investigators questioning whether they were dealing with delusion or pure evil. Ferrell's descent began with typical teenage rebellion, dyeing his hair black, wearing trench coats, immersing himself in vampire lore. But somewhere along the way, the fantasy consumed him. He started calling himself Versago, claiming to be a 500-year-old vampire overlord, and gathered a group of misfits he dubbed the Vampire Clan. At first, it was all theatrics, fake fangs, midnight graveyard visits, drinking animal blood for sustenance. Then, in 1996, the games turned deadly. Ferrell convinced his followers that to achieve true immortality, they needed human blood. Not just any blood, theirs had to be taken by force, the chosen victims. A couple in Eustis, Florida, Richard and Ruth Wendorf, parents of one of Ferrell's former followers. On the night of November 25th, Ferrell and his clan broke into the Wendorf's home, bludgeoning Richard with a crowbar before slashing Ruth's throat. But the brutality didn't end there. They drank from Ruth's wounds, smearing her blood on their faces like war paint. Ferrell later bragged in his journal that the taste made the night come alive. Then, in a move that would seal their fate, the group stole the Wendorf's car and drove to Louisiana, where they were caught after a high-speed chase, still wearing blood-stained clothes. What makes this case so chilling isn't just the savagery, it's how easily Ferrell weaponized loneliness. His followers weren't hardened criminals, they were outcasts, some as young as 14, who'd found belonging in his twisted fantasy. Psychiatrists argued Ferrell suffered from shared psychotic disorder, dragging others into his delusion, but the jury wasn't buying it. At trial, prosecutors played a jailhouse call where Ferrell coldly admitted, "I don't regret it. I'd do it again." He became the youngest person on Florida's death row at the time, though his sentence was later commuted to life. The aftermath left scars beyond the courtroom. The vampire panic of the 90s surged, with schools banning capes and plastic fangs. True crime documentaries dissected whether goth culture had gone too far. But the darkest legacy, Ferrell proved how quickly make-believe can curdle into madness, and how the line between fantasy and murder can vanish with a single drop of blood. In the sticky summer heat of 1987, a quiet Florida neighborhood became the stage for a crime that blurred the lines between fear and reality. 55-year-old Adela Proudham wasn't your typical murderer. She was a devout churchgoer, a mother of 4, and by all accounts a kind neighbor. But when she plunged a kitchen knife into her neighbor's chest 32 times, she didn't claim self-defense or temporary insanity. Her defense was far more unsettling. The voodoo made me do it. The victim, 60-year-old Marie Lavoie, had reportedly bragged about her family's dark connections in Haiti, even warning Adela that crossing her would summon ancient spirits. When Adela's son suddenly developed mysterious seizures and her husband lost his job, she became convinced Marie had cursed them. Local voodoo practitioners later testified that Adela had come to them desperate for protection, carrying bundles of herbs and chicken bones to ward off evil. But when her son's condition worsened, she snapped, later telling police, "I had to kill her to break the spell." What makes this case so chilling isn't just the violence, it's how deeply Adela believed in her own innocence. Crime scene photos showed crucifixes and salt circles around Marie's body, as if the murder itself had been a ritual. Prosecutors argued premeditation, pointing to the fact that Adela had bought the knife that morning. But her defense team brought in anthropologists who explained that in certain Haitian traditions, killing the caster was the only way to end a curse. The jury, faced with the impossible task of weighing cultural belief against cold-blooded murder, convicted her of manslaughter instead of first degree. The aftermath left the legal system grappling with questions no law could neatly answer. If someone truly believes their actions are justified by forces beyond our understanding, does that make them less guilty? Or just more tragic, Adela served 7 years, emerging as a haunted figure who still whispered about shadows following her. Marie's family, meanwhile, insisted she'd never practiced voodoo at all, just liked to spin tales to seem mysterious. In the end, this wasn't a story about dark magic. It was about the most human fear of all, that unseen forces control our fate, and that sometimes breaking free demands blood. The audacity of crime knows no bounds, but in 1876, a gang of grave robbers in New York City took chutzpah to new depths. When wealthy socialite Alexander Stewart died, his family spared no expense on the funeral, laying him to rest in a grand marble mausoleum. What they didn't expect was that Stewart's body would become the target of America's first high-profile corpse napping scheme. 2 nights after the burial, the grave was found pried open, the coffin empty, and a ransom note demanding $200,000, roughly $5 million today, for the return of the remains. The criminals hadn't just stolen a body, they'd stolen a symbol. Stewart wasn't just any millionaire. He was the retail tycoon behind America's first department store, a man so influential that his funeral drew crowds rivaling a presidential procession. The thieves knew his family couldn't bear the scandal of leaving him in a pauper's pit, and they played on that fear masterfully. Their letters dripped with menace, warning that Stewart's corpse would be fed to the fishes if police were contacted. But the family made one shrewd move. They hired private detective Alphonse Magnuson, a man whose flair for theatrics rivaled the criminal's own. Magnuson's plan was straight out of a dime novel. Disguising himself as a crooked undertaker, he infiltrated the city's shadowy cadaver trade, spreading word he'd pay top dollar for a high society specimen. When the thieves took the bait, they didn't realize the middleman they met in a dimly lit tavern was the same detective whose face had been plastered in newspapers vowing to recover Stewart. The final exchange went down at a remote barn in New Jersey, where Magnuson arrived with a satchel of marked bills and a dozen officers hiding in the hayloft. What makes this case so unforgettable isn't just the audacity of the crime, but the sheer ordinariness of the thieves. They weren't criminal masterminds, they were 2 disgruntled cemetery workers and a failed actor who'd seen one too many melodramas. At trial, their defense was almost laughable. They claimed they'd borrowed the body to pressure the Stewarts into donating to charity. The judge sentenced them to 7 years, but the real punishment was the ridicule. Newspapers mocked them as the world's worst businessmen for failing to recognize the detective, and penny dreadfuls turned their bungled scheme into comic strips. The Stewart case left an indelible mark on American law, leading to stricter cemetery security and the first statutes against corpse theft, but its legacy runs deeper than legislation. It exposed how even in death the rich aren't safe from greed, and how sometimes the best way to outsmart a criminal is to dress up like one. Today, Stewart's mausoleum stands locked behind iron gates, a silent testament to the night America learned that not even the grave is sacred when money's on the table. Family feuds over money can get ugly, but in 1946, one man took sibling rivalry to explosive new heights. Arthur Blacker wasn't just content with contesting his brother's will in court. No, he wanted to make sure the inheritance dispute ended with a literal bang. His weapon of choice, dynamite-packed cigarettes, meticulously crafted to detonate the moment his unsuspecting brother took a puff. The plan was diabolical in its simplicity. Blacker, a former World War II munitions worker, knew his way around explosives. He hollowed out several cigarettes, filling them with tiny charges rigged to ignite on contact with flame. Then, with cold calculation, he planted them in his brother's coat pocket during a visit, counting on a lifetime of shared smoking habits to do the rest. What he didn't account for, his brother's sudden decision to quit. Weeks passed, the deadly cigarettes gathering dust until a houseguest borrowed the coat and, out of politeness, offered one to a friend. The explosion that followed shredded the man's face, though miraculously he survived. Investigators initially assumed it was a freak accident, maybe a faulty match or some bizarre chemical reaction. But when they found identical rigged cigarettes in Blacker's workshop, the truth ignited faster than his homemade bombs. His defense at trial was as flimsy as cigarette paper. He claimed he'd been experimenting for fireworks displays. The jury didn't buy it, especially after learning he stood to inherit a fortune if his brother died. Blacker was convicted of attempted murder, though the judge couldn't resist a dark joke. Next time, try a less smoking gun approach. What makes this case so absurd isn't just the over-the-top method, it's the sheer pettiness behind it. For the price of a few cigarettes, Blacker gambled his freedom on the assumption his brother would light up one last time. Instead, he proved that when greed and resentment fuse, even the simplest vice can become a murder weapon, and for his intended victim, the scare worked. He quit smoking for good. Most bank robbers plan their getaways down to the second, counting stacks of cash, mapping escape routes, even rehearsing their demands. But in 2003, one Florida man proved that sometimes the biggest heist flaw isn't the plan, it's the execution. When 26-year-old Corey Miller stormed into a Bank of America branch in Deerfield Beach, he seemed to have everything under control. Waving a gun, he herded employees into the vault, barking orders like a Hollywood villain. Then came the twist. In his frenzy to secure the room, Miller accidentally locked himself inside with the terrified staff and no money. For nearly 4 hours, police surrounded the bank while Miller, trapped in a panic room designed to stop thieves, desperately tried to negotiate his way out. Employees later described the scene as equal parts terrifying and absurd. A would-be criminal pacing furiously in a 6-by-8-foot space, realizing too late that vault doors don't open from the inside without a code. Meanwhile, the actual cash still sitting untouched in the teller drawers, just feet away from the vault's impenetrable walls, the icing on this comedy of errors. When SWAT finally breached the vault, they found Miller hadn't even brought a bag to carry loot. His entire scheme hinged on stuffing bills into his pockets, a plan that fell apart before he'd grabbed a single dollar. At trial, prosecutors played security footage showing the moment realization dawned on Miller's face, the slow-motion horror of recognizing he'd botched his own crime. His defense attorney argued temporary insanity, citing a crippling fear of poverty. The judge wasn't swayed, sentencing him to 3 years for what newspapers dubbed the dumbest heist in Florida history. What makes this case more than just a punchline is what it reveals about criminal psychology. Most robbers fail because they're caught. Miller failed because he outsmarted himself. The vault, meant to protect money from people like him, became his prison instead. And for the employees, they got an unforgettable story, plus bragging rights about the day they literally locked up their own robber. Sometimes justice doesn't need handcuffs, just better door hardware. In the concrete jungle of New York City, where honking horns and double-parked cars are part of the daily soundtrack, road rage is almost expected. But what happened on a sweltering July afternoon in 2018 crossed the line from urban frustration into unthinkable violence. Dr. Jiwon Dong, a 61-year-old anesthesiologist with a spotless reputation, had just pulled into his reserved parking space outside a Queens medical center when another driver, 35-year-old Joseph Owusu, aggressively blocked him in. Witnesses described a shouting match that escalated in seconds, Dong allegedly drawing a licensed handgun and firing 4 shots into Owusu's chest as the younger man sat defenseless behind the wheel. What turned this from a tragic headline into a national debate was the sheer absurdity of the catalyst: a parking dispute. Not a robbery, not a gang feud, just 2 stressed professionals snapping over a 12-foot rectangle of asphalt. Security footage showed Owusu had been circling the lot for nearly 20 minutes before the confrontation, his frustration boiling over when he saw Dong, who'd paid for the reserved spot, slide into it effortlessly. Neighbors later admitted parking wars were common in the area, with one joking, "People here would kill for a spot," until someone actually did. The aftermath ripped open uncomfortable questions about urban life. Dong's defense argued he'd been harassed for months over the coveted space, even producing threatening notes left on his windshield. Prosecutors countered that no piece of pavement justified execution-style murder, pointing out Owusu was unarmed and still buckled in when he died. Psychologists testified about environmental stress disorder, where chronic overcrowding and competition erode civility. The jury grappled with an impossible question: was this cold-blooded murder or the tragic culmination of city life pushed to its breaking point? Dong's conviction for manslaughter rather than murder reflected that ambiguity. He got 20 years, but the cultural scars lingered. Cities nationwide reevaluated parking policies, with some installing surveillance cameras and mediation signs in volatile lots. Urban planners cited the case when advocating for more green spaces, arguing that concrete dystopias breed short fuses. For Owusu's family, no sentence could rationalize losing a son over something so trivial. And for New Yorkers, the next time someone steals their spot, they might just let it go, because in a split second, any one of us could become either Dong or Owusu. Prison walls are meant to be the ultimate deterrent: thick concrete, razor wire, eyes always watching. But in June 2015, 2 inmates at New York's Clinton Correctional Facility proved that even the most secure system has cracks. Richard Matt and David Sweat didn't just dream of escape, they turned their prison cells into a diabolical workshop, engineering a breakout so audacious it felt ripped from a Hollywood script. Over months, they used smuggled power tools to carve through steel walls, navigate dark tunnels, and emerge from a manhole outside the prison walls, only to discover freedom was a lot harder to hold onto than they imagined. Their plan was equal parts meticulous and reckless. Matt, a convicted murderer serving 25 years to life, and Sweat, doing life for killing a deputy sheriff, worked adjacent cells in the honor block, a privilege they exploited. With help from a civilian prison worker, they smuggled in hacksaw blades, drill bits, and even a screwdriver bit attached to a makeshift crank. Night after night, they cut through the backs of their steel cells, crawling into the narrow space behind to chip through cinder blocks. The noise, covered by the prison's constant din of clanging doors and shouting inmates. The dust swept into toilet paper tubes and flushed away. They even crafted dummy heads from papier-mâché, painted with their hair color, complete with eyeglasses, to fool guards during nighttime bed checks. The real stroke of genius, their path led through the prison's bowels, literally. They shimmied down 5 stories of piping into a labyrinth of steam tunnels, then drilled through a 2-foot thick brick wall, popping out near a manhole cover on the other side of the perimeter fence. For 3 weeks, over 100 law enforcement officers scoured the dense Adirondack forests, chasing false leads while the duo survived on stolen supplies from nearby cabins. But here's where their plan unraveled Matt's ego. He got drunk on stolen wine and started a campfire smoke that led a tactical team straight to him. Sweat was shot and captured days later, just yards from the Canadian border. What makes this escape so unforgettable isn't just the craftsmanship, it's the irony. These men had the discipline to execute a near-perfect prison break, but none of the restraint needed to stay free. The prison worker who aided them got 7 years, while the pair became cautionary tales. Matt was killed in a standoff, while Sweat, now in solitary confinement, reportedly spends his days sketching blueprints of his next escape, the real legacy. Clinton's honor block was permanently closed, proving sometimes the most dangerous flaws in a system aren't in the walls, they're in the privileges we give those who know how to exploit them. Most courtroom evidence comes in the form of fingerprints, DNA samples, or eyewitness testimony. But in 1994, a Florida jury found themselves considering something far more unusual, the word of a doll. And not just any doll, Robert, the infamous haunted toy that had terrorized Key West for nearly a century. When 42-year-old Elise Hutton was found strangled in her home, police had few leads until her brother claimed Robert, the antique doll displayed in her living room, had witnessed the murder. What followed wasn't just a murder trial, it was America's first legal case where the paranormal took the stand. The legend of Robert the Doll was already well known in Florida. Gifted to artist Robert Eugene Otto in the early 1900s, the stuffed figure allegedly moved on its own, whispered threats, and left behind a trail of slashed furniture and nightmares. After Otto's death, the doll passed through several owners, each reporting bizarre incidents until it landed with Elise, a paranormal investigator who treated Robert more like a roommate than an artifact. Her brother later testified that Elise had told him, "Robert doesn't like strangers." Just days before her death, the killer, he insisted, must have triggered the doll's wrath. Prosecutors initially dismissed the idea until 3 separate psychics, brought in as spiritual consultants, each described the same vivid vision. Robert's glass eyes watching as a man in a red jacket forced Elise to the ground. One medium claimed the doll communicated through cold spots and electrical interference, while another said Robert projected images of the attack into her dreams. The defense scoffed, calling it ghost story nonsense, but the judge allowed the testimony as character evidence, arguing the jury could weigh its credibility like any other witness. What happened next was surreal. Prosecutors placed Robert himself, still dressed in his frayed sailor suit, on an evidence table, as if expecting him to point a stitched finger at the accused. The psychic's testimony, combined with a neighbor's account of seeing a man in red fleeing the scene, helped convict Elise's ex-boyfriend, but the real shock came after the verdict. Court deputies swore the doll's expression changed when the guilty verdict was read, its usual sinister grin twisting into something closer to satisfaction. The case set no legal precedent, but it left an indelible mark on forensic folklore. Today, Robert sits behind glass in a Key West museum, where visitors still ask if he really testified. The answer depends on who you ask. Lawyers call it circumstantial evidence bolstered by coincidence. True crime enthusiasts call it proof that sometimes justice wears many faces, even one made of thread and sawdust. And for the jurors who felt an unnatural chill in the courtroom that day, they'll tell you some witnesses don't need a voice to be heard. Insurance fraud has taken some wild forms over the years, but few schemes can top the sheer audacity of John Allen's death by shark attack. Picture the Florida coast in 1985. A bloody swim fin washes ashore, a cluster of shark teeth embedded in the rubber. Nearby, a single sneaker with a severed foot still inside. The scene screamed tragedy, a man devoured by the ocean's most feared predator. There was just one problem. That foot wasn't John Allen's, it belonged to a cadaver. Allen, a struggling businessman drowning in debt, saw his escape route in the jaws of a shark. Or at least that's what he wanted authorities to believe. He'd spent months studying shark behavior, even consulting a dentist to carefully place real shark teeth into the fake swim fin. The masterstroke, slipping dental records into the shoe, ensuring the foot would be identified as his. It was the perfect crime until a marine biologist took one look at the so-called bite marks and noticed something off. Real shark bites crush bone. These were too clean, almost surgical. Then came the kicker. The dental records were too perfect. Allen had used his own X-rays but forgot that human teeth don't survive shark digestion intact. The unraveling was swift. Investigators found Allen alive in Costa Rica, living under an alias but still using his real signature on bank documents. His downfall. Overestimating nature's brutality and underestimating forensics. At trial, prosecutors displayed the swim fin like a prop from a bad horror movie, pointing out where Allen had glued the teeth himself. The judge called it the least convincing predator since Jaws 3. What makes this case so deliciously absurd isn't just the failed science, it's the psychology. Allen didn't just want to disappear, he wanted a story, something so dramatic no one would question it. In the end, his ego wrote checks his planning couldn't cash. And for shark experts, they got a new teaching tool, How Not to Fake Your Death by Marine Life 101. The ocean has enough real horrors without bad actors, literally, adding to the list. DNA evidence is often considered the gold standard in criminal cases, unimpeachable, scientific proof of guilt. But in 2003, a Louisiana murderer found a bizarre loophole. Identical twins share nearly identical DNA. When 26-year-old Ryan Matthews was arrested for the shotgun killing of a grocery store owner, he didn't deny his DNA was at the scene. Instead, he pointed the finger at his mirror image sibling, Randy, with a shrug. How can you prove it wasn't him? What followed wasn't just a legal first, it was a high-stakes game of biological whodunit that left jurors staring at two faces and one set of fingerprints. The crime itself was brutal. Surveillance footage showed a masked gunman bursting into Bridge City Market before dawn, shooting 55-year-old Conrad Roseman point-blank during a botched robbery. The killer dropped a ski mask while fleeing a mask that later yielded Ryan's DNA. But here's where the case took a surreal turn. Ryan's defense team didn't contest the science, they weaponized it. Identical twins developed from the same fertilized egg, sharing 100% of their genetic code. Under a microscope, Ryan and Randy's DNA was indistinguishable. The defense's argument, reasonable doubt lies in that 1% biological margin of error. Prosecutors faced a nightmare scenario. Without footage of the killer's face or witnesses who could distinguish the twins, they had to rely on something DNA couldn't provide: individuality. Their breakthrough came from an unlikely source: epigenetics, the study of how environment alters gene expression. While the twins' DNA was identical, years of smoking, diet, and even stress had left chemical markers on Randy's genes that Ryan didn't share. The clincher, a single allele linked to pesticide exposure from Randy's job as a sugarcane farmer. It wasn't enough to convict Randy, but it shattered the twins' biological alibi for Ryan. But the real twist unfolded outside the lab. During jury selection, prosecutors made an unorthodox request. Look at their eyes. Ryan had a faint scar above his brow from a childhood accident, invisible in the grainy footage, but noticeable up close. More damning, the twins' own family testified that Ryan had borrowed Randy's car that night, and cell tower data placed it near the store. The defense's gamble had backfired spectacularly. By forcing experts to dive deeper into the science, they'd inadvertently given prosecutors new tools to isolate Ryan's guilt. The verdict, guilty, set a legal precedent, but the legacy is stranger than fiction. Crime labs now keep twin databases, and detectives are trained to ask a new question early in investigations. Does the suspect have an identical sibling? As for Ryan, he's serving life in Angola prison, where guards say his twin hasn't visited once. Some alibis are so perfect they only work in theory, and sometimes the only thing sharper than DNA evidence is the truth staring back at you in a courtroom. In the summer of 2010, a convenience store clerk in North Carolina thought he'd pulled off the perfect crime right until he forgot one crucial detail: cameras don't blink. For weeks, customers at the Speedway gas station had been scratching off lottery tickets at the counter, dreaming of sudden fortunes. But when a regular named Willis finally uncovered a $250,000 winner, the clerk behind the register saw an opportunity too tempting to resist. The scheme was simple but brazen. As Willis handed over the winning ticket for verification, the clerk, 49-year-old Christopher Shaw, palmed it with the speed of a street magician, replacing it with a worthless duplicate from the trash. To the untrained eye, the switch was flawless. The fake ticket even had the same crinkled edges and faded ink. But Shaw hadn't accounted for the high-definition surveillance camera mounted directly above his head, capturing every furtive glance and shaky-handed swap. What makes this heist so darkly comedic isn't just the theft, it's the sheer arrogance of the aftermath. Shaw immediately called his wife, breathlessly announcing they were set for life, unaware the entire conversation was being recorded by the Lottery Commission's fraud hotline. Investigators later traced him to a check cashing store where he tried to redeem the prize, only to freeze when asked for ID. The real punchline: Willis, the actual winner, was legally blind. He'd trusted Shaw completely, never suspecting the man he greeted by name every morning would exploit his disability. The trial became a masterclass in poetic justice. Prosecutors played the surveillance footage frame by frame, zooming in on Shaw's tell, a split-second smirk as he slid the fake ticket back across the counter. His defense attorney, grasping at straws, argued the footage was too grainy to prove intent. The jury disagreed, deliberating for less than an hour before convicting Shaw of felony fraud. But the sweetest twist came later. Thanks to North Carolina's whistleblower laws, Willis eventually received every penny of his stolen winnings plus interest, while Shaw traded his clerk's vest for an orange jumpsuit. This wasn't just a crime about greed, it was about the fragility of trust. Shaw had spent years building rapport with customers, only to torch that goodwill for a payout that lasted all of 48 hours in his hands. And for lottery officials, they got a new training video now shown to every retailer in the state, with Shaw's nervous hands as the star. Sometimes the easiest way to catch a thief isn't with fancy forensics, just a camera and a blind man's unwavering honesty. On a quiet afternoon in May 2016, the last thing YouTube viewers expected to see when they clicked on a live stream titled "One Crazy Day" was a murder confession in real time. But that's exactly what happened when 33-year-old Steve Stevens aimed his phone camera at his own face, calmly admitted he just shot an elderly stranger, and then vowed to keep killing until police stopped him. What followed wasn't just a crime, it was a grotesque experiment in viral violence, a manhunt played out in the comment sections and shares of social media. The video started like any other vlog: Stevens sitting in his car, speaking directly to the lens with unsettling casualness. "I snapped," he said, grinning as if sharing a funny story. Then came the bombshell: "I just killed a dude, 74-year-old Robert Godwin, just did it." He even showed the gun. For a moment, viewers assumed it was a tasteless prank, until Stevens drove to a nearby park, approached Godwin on the sidewalk, and without hesitation raised the weapon. The live stream cut out seconds after the gunshot, but the damage was done. The video spread like wildfire, racking up millions of views before YouTube could take it down, turning a local tragedy into a global spectacle. What made this case so chilling wasn't just the brutality, it was how Stevens weaponized the internet's architecture. He knew exactly how algorithms would prioritize shocking content, how shares would amplify his notoriety. Between murders, he posted taunting videos, even calling his mother on Facebook Live to brag. At one point, he filmed himself ordering fast food, grinning at the cashier who had no idea she was serving a wanted killer. The manhunt became a surreal mix of digital breadcrumbs and real-world terror, with tips flooding in from as far away as Germany. But here's the twist that still haunts law enforcement. Stevens didn't just want to kill, he wanted an audience. His final act was another live stream, this time with police sirens wailing in the background. "They're gonna kill me," he muttered before the screen went black. Moments later, he took his own life as officers closed in. In the aftermath, platforms scrambled to tighten live streaming policies, but the genie was already out of the bottle. Godwin's family had to plead with strangers to stop sharing the video of their father's death. True crime forums dissected frame-by-frame screenshots. And for the first time, America confronted a new kind of killer, one who didn't just commit crimes for the thrill, but for the likes. This case rewrote the rules of manhunts, proving that in the digital age, a murderer can turn the entire internet into a co-conspirator. It also exposed the dark side of virality, how outrage and fascination can fuel a killer's ego long after the trigger's been pulled. Today, Godwin is remembered not for how he died, but for the grace of his family who forgave Stevens publicly. As for the video, it lives on in fragments, a grim reminder that some crimes don't end when the handcuffs click. They keep playing on loop. On a calm December morning in 1872, the merchant ship Mary Celeste was spotted drifting aimlessly near the Azores, her sails tattered but intact. When rescuers boarded, they found the vessel eerily deserted, breakfast still warm on the table, laundry hanging to dry, even the cruise pipes resting in neat rows. Only the ship's lifeboat was missing, along with every soul aboard. No signs of struggle, no water damage, just an unsettling vacuum where 10 people should have been. For over a century, this became the ultimate maritime ghost story, until evidence emerged that the real horror wasn't supernatural greed at all. The Mary Celeste's captain, Benjamin Briggs, was no reckless sailor. A devout family man, he'd brought his wife and toddler daughter on this routine voyage, stocking the ship with 6 months of provisions. Yet when the British brig Dei Gratia stumbled upon the drifting vessel, every logbook and navigational tool remained untouched except for one cryptic final entry estimating the ship's position just off Santa Maria Island. That single clue became the linchpin of a theory too scandalous for Victorian newspapers to print. The abandonment was staged, possibly by Briggs himself, as part of an elaborate insurance scam. Here's where the plot thickens. The Mary Celeste's owner, a shady financier named James Winchester, had heavily insured both ship and cargo, mostly barrels of denatured alcohol worth a fortune. But investigators later discovered those barrels had been tampered with, some nearly empty. The prevailing theory, the crew fearing fumes from leaking alcohol would trigger an explosion, temporarily evacuated to the lifeboat. A rogue wave or sudden squall then severed the tow line, leaving them to drown while the perfectly seaworthy ship drifted on. But maritime historians uncovered darker possibilities. Winchester had a history of insuring dubious cargo, and the Mary Celeste's previous captain had mysteriously quit mid-voyage, calling the vessel cursed. Court records show Winchester later sued the insurance company, demanding full payment despite the crew's disappearance, a payout that would have been impossible if mutiny or piracy were proven. Even the ship's name changed from Amazon to Mary Celeste shortly before the incident raised red flags, a common tactic among fraudsters to obscure a vessel's troubled past. The most damning twist came in 1985, when divers found the Mary Celeste's wreck off Haiti, deliberately scuttled years after the abandonment, likely for another insurance payout. By then, the ghost ship legend had eclipsed the truth, immortalized by Arthur Conan Doyle's fictionalized account that invented phantom meals and bloodstained sabers. Today, forensic accountants argue the real mystery isn't what happened to Briggs' crew, it's how many times Winchester profited from their tragedy. The sea may keep its secrets, but greed leaves paper trails. And sometimes the scariest ghosts aren't the ones who vanish without a trace, but those who leave too many fingerprints behind. There's something uniquely sinister about poisoning, the way it transforms everyday acts of care into weapons. And in 1895, one woman weaponized dessert in a way so cold-blooded it made history. When 34-year-old Lydia Sherman served her husband, Edward, a helping of plum pudding at their Connecticut dinner table, she didn't just lace it with arsenic, she watched, smiling, as he writhed in agony, then calmly told their children, "Papa's just had a spell." What makes this case so chilling isn't just the method, it's the premeditation. Lydia wasn't some panicked spouse snapping in the heat of an argument. She'd spent weeks perfecting her recipe, testing doses on stray animals before settling on the perfect blend of sweetness and lethality. Neighbors later recalled her buying arsenic under the guise of rat poison, laughing with shopkeepers about her persistent vermin problem. The irony, Edward, a chronically ill shoemaker, was already dying of tuberculosis. Lydia's impatience for his life insurance payout turned her from caregiver to executioner. The real horror unfolded after Edward's death. When doctors initially ruled it natural causes, Lydia didn't lay low, she doubled down. Within months, her elderly father-in-law moved in, only to die after eating her special custard. Then her sister-in-law collapsed after tea. By the time authorities exhumed the bodies, the pattern was clear. Lydia had turned her kitchen into an assembly line of death. At trial, prosecutors presented a ledger where she tallied her victims' life insurance policies like grocery lists. Yet the most unsettling detail emerged in her confession. Lydia didn't express remorse. She complained about the inconvenience of funerals cutting into her sewing circle meetings. Her motivation, pure financial pragmatism. With each death, she upgraded her home, bought new dresses, even took a vacation to Niagara Falls. The press dubbed her the Derby poisoner, but Lydia saw herself as a businesswoman. "Widowhood suits me," she allegedly told a cellmate. The trial became a spectacle of Victorian hypocrisy. Newspapers feigned shock at a woman's capacity for violence, even as they sold lurid illustrations of her demonic grin. Psychiatrists debated whether she was hysterical or simply evil, never considering that greed, not madness, might be explanation enough. Convicted of only 3 murders, though suspected in at least 11, Lydia spent her final years in prison, knitting blankets and writing recipes for guards. Her legacy, a morbid punchline in true crime history and a warning about the banality of evil. Poison doesn't require rage or strength, just patience and a spoon. And for Edward, his last meal wasn't just betrayal. It was proof that love, like arsenic, can be fatal in the right dose. It sounds like the plot of a low-budget prison comedy, 12 inmates waltzing out of an Alabama jail by exploiting one simple oversight: peanut butter. But in July 2017, that's exactly what happened at the Walker County Jail, where a group of prisoners turned snack food into a skeleton key. The plan was ludicrously simple. One inmate noticed that the numbers on cell doors matched the digits on meal trays. So when a guard left a jar of peanut butter unattended, they smeared it over the door's control panel, then scrawled the number for an exterior door on top. A rookie officer, seeing what looked like an official label, pressed the button, unlocking not just one cell but the entire pod. The chaos that followed was equal parts hilarious and humiliating. Inmates sprinted through the open door, some stopping to taunt surveillance cameras by waving peanut butter-smeared spoons like trophies. One even climbed onto the roof, basking in freedom for a full 20 minutes before realizing he had nowhere to go. Local cops later described the scene as a bad episode of Scooby-Doo, complete with suspects tripping over each other in their escape attempts. All 12 were recaptured within hours, but not before one managed to call his grandmother from a stolen phone, bragging that he'd outsmarted the system with GIF. What makes this escape so absurd isn't just the method, it's the sheer audacity of the bluff. These weren't masterminds with smuggled tools, they were guys who saw a condiment and thought, why not? The sheriff's office tried to downplay it as a temporary staffing issue, but the internet crowned it the Great Peanut Butter Jailbreak, memes flooding social media. Security experts pointed out the glaring flaw. If a door's access system can be fooled by a food smear, it was never secure to begin with, the real punchline. After the recapture, the jail's solution wasn't high-tech upgrades, it was banning peanut butter, because in the end, the dumbest escapes reveal the dumbest vulnerabilities. And sometimes all it takes to expose them is a sticky jaw and a straight face. Living someone else's life usually belongs in the realm of spy movies, but for Joanne McNamara, it became a decades-long performance worthy of an Oscar. In 2002, this unassuming Michigan woman made headlines when investigators discovered she'd been living under the identity of a child who died in a car crash 35 years earlier. Not just as an alias, she'd fully reconstructed the girl's life, from social security number to school records, building an entire existence on borrowed time. The story began in 1967, when 4-year-old Julie Ann Williams perished in a horrific accident in Texas. Her death certificate was filed, her family mourned, and then somehow her name was plucked from bureaucratic obscurity years later by McNamara, who was then in her early 20s. Using Julie's birth certificate, she secured a new social security card, a driver's license, even a passport. But here's where the scam turned surreal. McNamara didn't just steal Julie's identity for financial fraud. She became Julie, enrolling in community college under the dead girl's name, holding jobs, paying taxes, constructing a whole life where the paper trail led back to a toddler's grave. The unraveling came through sheer coincidence. When McNamara applied for a federal student loan in 2001, a routine check flagged Julie's social security number as belonging to a deceased person. At first, officials assumed it was a clerical error until they pulled Julie's original death certificate. Confronted by investigators, McNamara initially claimed she was the real Julie, spinning a fantastical tale of amnesia and kidnapping. Fingerprints proved otherwise, revealing she was actually a woman who'd vanished from her own life in the 1980s after a bitter divorce. What makes this case so haunting isn't just the identity theft, it's the psychological toll of maintaining the lie. Neighbors described Julie as painfully private, avoiding doctors who might request medical records and panicking whenever childhood memories came up in conversation. She'd created elaborate backstories to explain gaps in Julie's timeline, even forging letters from imaginary relatives. But the darkest detail: McNamara had chosen Julie's identity specifically because the girl had no living immediate family left to question her resurrection. The legal fallout rewrote how agencies handled death records. Until McNamara's arrest, there was no centralized system to flag social security numbers of the deceased. Today, her case is studied in identity theft seminars as the ultimate warning about bureaucracy's blind spots. As for McNamara herself, after pleading guilty to fraud, she served 18 months, then vanished again, this time into obscurity. Perhaps the strangest twist of all, in stealing a dead girl's future, she'd somehow managed to erase her own past twice over. Some crimes leave behind haunting images, but few are as grotesquely surreal as the legacy of Walter Coles, a Michigan taxidermist whose home became a macabre gallery of his darkest secret. In 1953, neighbors noticed something off about Coles's behavior, the way he'd brag about his latest project with a smirk, or how his wife, Elena, hadn't been seen in months. When police finally entered his cluttered workshop, they found her seated at the kitchen table, perfectly preserved, her glassy eyes staring blankly at a half-finished cup of coffee. Coles hadn't just murdered Elena, he'd turned her into his final masterpiece. The details were straight out of a nightmare. Investigators discovered Coles had injected Elena's veins with embalming fluid before meticulously stitching her skin back together, posing her like one of his prized animal mounts. What made the scene even more chilling was the context. Elena sat surrounded by Coles's other works, a menagerie of stuffed bobcats and deer, as if she were just another exhibit in his twisted collection. The coroner's report revealed she'd been dead for nearly a year, her body kept so well preserved that decomposition had barely begun. Coles, when confronted, didn't deny it. Instead, he calmly explained that he couldn't bear to part with her, so he'd done what he knew best. I fixed her so she'd stay. But here's where the case takes an even darker turn. Buried beneath the horror was a decades-long pattern of control. Former neighbors later testified that Coles had always treated Elena like property, dictating her friendships, isolating her from family. Psychiatrists suggested the taxidermy wasn't just a crime of passion, but the ultimate act of possession. In his mind, if he couldn't have her alive, he'd make sure no one else could have her at all. Even in death, she remained under his hand, a permanent fixture in his workshop. The trial was a media circus, with newspapers dubbing Coles the human stuffer. The defense argued insanity, pointing to his obsessive craftsmanship and the shrine-like way he'd arranged Elena's body. Prosecutors countered that his precision proved cold calculation. This wasn't madness, but monstrous intent. In the end, the jury convicted him of first-degree murder, though Coles never expressed remorse. His final words before sentencing, "At least she's still here." The case forced America to confront uncomfortable questions about love, obsession, and the line between art and atrocity. For taxidermists, it became a cautionary tale about detachment, how the craft's focus on permanence could curdle into something inhuman. And for Elena, her fate was a grim reminder that some victims never truly escape, even after the last breath. Today, her story lingers in forensic textbooks, not just as a crime, but as a warning. When love turns to preservation, it's no longer love at all. It's just another kind of taxidermy. At first glance, the grainy surveillance footage looked like every parent's worst nightmare. A young woman in a jogging suit, headphones dangling, suddenly yanked into a white van by two masked men. The video went viral instantly, just as 23-year-old influencer Sherry Papini had planned, because in 2016, this wasn't a real kidnapping. It was a meticulously staged hoax, a desperate bid for internet fame that unraveled in ways Papini never saw coming. Papini's story had all the hallmarks of a true crime sensation. The California mom vanished during a morning run, sparking a frantic 3-week search. When she reappeared on Thanksgiving Day, bruised and branded, her tale of captivity by two Hispanic women, complete with bizarre details like being chained in a closet and fed only oranges, dominated national news. Supporters raised over $50,000 for her recovery. Law enforcement launched a massive manhunt. There was just one problem: every single detail was fabricated. The cracks started showing when detectives noticed inconsistencies in Papini's account. The brand on her shoulder, a DEFY burn from a heated tool, the DNA under her fingernails. Her own, planted to mimic struggle evidence. Then came the digital breadcrumb cell records, placing her not in a kidnapper's lair, but at an ex-boyfriend's apartment where she'd holed up to stage photos of her injuries. The final nail in the coffin, a $20,000 payment from the ex to keep quiet, proving this wasn't just a cry for attention, it was a financial scheme. What makes this case so infuriating isn't just the deception, it's the collateral damage. Papini's hoax siphoned resources from actual missing persons cases, stoked racial stereotypes with her fictional Latina kidnappers, and left her own children traumatized by the lie that mom had been tortured. At sentencing, the judge called her actions a staggering waste of public empathy, while true crime communities grappled with a new reality. In the age of viral fame, some stories are too twisted to be true, and some storytellers will burn everything, even their own lives, for the spotlight. The aftermath rewrote the rules for how law enforcement handles high-profile disappearances. Police now quietly verify digital alibis before press conferences, and GoFundMe campaigns face stricter scrutiny. As for Papini, she served less than a year in prison, but her name is forever tethered to the ultimate cautionary tale. When you fake a crime for clout, the only thing you're really stealing is your own future. Most killers try to cover their tracks, but in 1978, one murderer turned his crimes into a sick game of cat and mouse with the clues hidden in plain sight. For weeks, the San Francisco Chronicle's crossword puzzle section carried a series of eerie hints, each one subtly pointing to the next victim's location. At first, nobody noticed the pattern until a sharp-eyed detective realized the harmless pastime had become a serial killer's twisted scoreboard. The killer, later identified as Timothy Rader, wasn't just a murderer, he was a wordsmith with a grudge. A failed crossword constructor whose puzzles had been repeatedly rejected by major publications, Rader saw his crimes as the ultimate revenge against a world that ignored his brilliance. Each victim was chosen based on their connection to newspapers or publishing librarians, proofreaders, even a retired typesetter. And after each killing, Rader would mail in a new crossword puzzle to the Chronicle, its themes and answers laced with clues only investigators could decode. One puzzle's theme was Bay Area landmarks, with the longest answer reading Golden Gate Bridge. Detectives initially dismissed it as coincidence, until a jogger found the next victim's body beneath the bridge, a torn crossword page tucked into her pocket. Another puzzle featured the clue Where Ink Dries Before Dawn, with the answer Print Office. That very night, a security guard was stabbed to death outside a printing plant. Rader wasn't just leaving breadcrumbs, he was mocking the police, daring them to outthink him at his own game. The turning point came when a linguistics professor noticed something chilling. Rader's puzzles contained acrostics, hidden messages formed by the first letters of each answer. One spelled out, "Seek the clock tower." Police raced to the ferry building's clock tower and found Rader waiting, not to kill, but to watch. He'd positioned himself to witness the moment authorities finally cracked his code. What makes this case so unnerving isn't just the murders, it's the arrogance. Rader didn't just want to inflict pain, he wanted an audience for his intellect. Even after his arrest, he insisted the puzzles weren't confessions, they were his masterpieces. Today, forensic linguists still study his crosswords as a blueprint for how ego can unravel even the smartest criminals. Because in the end, Rader's fatal flaw wasn't his love of puzzles, it was his need to prove he was the cleverest player in a game nobody else knew they were playing. The summer sun beat down on Miami's MacArthur Causeway in 2012, turning the pavement into a griddle, but the heat wasn't what made witnesses recoil in horror. That honor went to 31-year-old Ruddy Eugene, naked and snarling, crouched over a homeless man's lifeless body like something out of a horror movie. By the time police arrived, Eugene had chewed off nearly 80% of the victim's face, growling at officers like a rabid animal before they shot him dead. The incident might have been written off as a tragic psychotic break, except for the 4 words that turned it into a legal first. The bath salts made me. Eugene's autopsy revealed no trace of the synthetic drug in his system, but the damage was done. His public defender, grasping for an explanation amid the media frenzy, floated the now infamous zombie defense, the claim that bath salts had triggered a psychotic episode so severe Eugene believed he was the walking dead. The argument hinged on scattered reports of the drug causing extreme hallucinations and superhuman strength, with one ER doctor describing patients gnawing at their own limbs like they were trying to shed skin. Suddenly, a grisly assault became a national debate about drug-induced insanity and the limits of criminal responsibility. What makes this case so unsettling isn't just the violence, it's how it forced America to confront the gap between myth and medical reality. Bath salts, a catch-all term for stimulants like MDPV and mephedrone, can trigger paranoid delusions and hyperaggression. But Eugene's toxicology showed only marijuana in his bloodstream, leaving experts divided. Was this a case of undetectable designer drugs, an undiagnosed mental illness, or something even darker? The medical examiner's report added another layer. The victim, 65-year-old Ronald Popo, had traces of cocaine and alcohol in his system, suggesting two impaired men colliding in a perfect storm of vulnerability. The legal aftermath rippled far beyond Miami. While Popo survived blind and disfigured, but resilient, Eugene's family sued the city, arguing police should have used non-lethal force. Legislators rushed to ban bath salts despite the lack of concrete evidence linking them to the attack. True crime forums erupted with conspiracy theories, from government drug trials gone wrong to biblical demonic possession. But the most enduring legacy was the zombie defense itself, a term now etched into legal lexicon as shorthand for the impossible task of prosecuting someone who, in their own mind, wasn't even human when they committed their crimes. In the end, the case closed without a trial, leaving behind more questions than answers. Without Eugene alive to explain himself, we'll never know what truly happened on that causeway. But one thing's certain: when the sun sets over Miami, shadows stretch long enough to make anyone wonder how thin is the line between man and monster, really. And in a world where chemicals can rewrite reality, maybe the scariest thought of all is that next time, the zombie might not need drugs to believe its own nightmare. Truth, as they say, is stranger than fiction, but after these 31 tales, you might be wondering if strange even begins to cover it. From syrup tsunamis to Santa shootouts, peanut butter jailbreaks to poetic serial killers, America's criminal history isn't just dark. It's a carnival of the absurd, where logic takes a backseat and human behavior veers into the unimaginable. What makes these stories so fascinating isn't just the shock value. It's the reminder that behind every bizarre headline, there's a flawed, desperate, or downright delusional mind that thought, even for a second, that their scheme might actually work. Think about it: a dentist grave robbing smiles, a man faking his death with a shark's help, or a killer hiding confessions in crossword puzzles. These aren't just crimes, they're dark comedies of errors, tragedies laced with irony so thick you could choke on it. Yet beneath the absurdity lies something more unsettling: proof that reality has no obligation to make sense. The legal system, forensic science, and even common decency get twisted into knots when faced with the sheer creativity of human mischief. And while we might laugh at the sheer audacity of these stories, they also force us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The line between genius and madness, between cunning and stupidity, is thinner than we'd like to admit. But here's the thing: these stories aren't just morbid entertainment. They're cautionary tales, societal mirrors, and sometimes, bizarrely, catalysts for change. The Great Molasses Flood led to industrial safety reforms. The Amish beard attacks tested the boundaries of hate crime laws. Even Sherry Papini's hoax reshaped how missing persons cases are handled. Every absurd crime leaves behind fingerprints on history, however strange those prints may be. So now it's your turn. Which of these stories made your jaw drop the hardest? Have you encountered a local legend or unsolved mystery that rivals these in sheer weirdness? Drop your favorites in the comments, because if there's one thing this deep dive proves, it's that the world of true crime is bottomless, and the next absurd tale might be lurking just around the corner. And if you're craving more macabre histories, twisted twists, and crimes that defy explanation, hit that subscribe button. After all, reality's darkest chapters are still being written, and you won't want to miss what comes next.